My beloved child, something shifted in a conversation you were never meant to hear, and the strangest part is that your name was not spoken with anger at first, it was spoken with hesitation, almost as though someone had been carrying an opinion about you for a long time and had finally found the moment to release it. Your soulmate was listening. Quietly. Carefully. And across from them sat a third party who believed they understood the entire story. They thought they knew what your silence meant. They thought they understood the distance, the unanswered questions, the moments when you stepped back instead of explaining yourself. And then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely: you need to stay away from them. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. That silence was important, because somewhere beneath the surface, something inside them resisted what they were hearing. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough to create a question. Why would someone be so certain about a story they had only seen from the outside? And why did their warning sound less like concern and more like a conclusion formed long ago? Don't skip, because the truth that began surfacing after that conversation was not the kind of truth anyone could force. It appeared slowly, through little inconsistencies, forgotten details, and one realization your soulmate could no longer ignore. The third party had been describing your actions, but they had never understood your reasons. There is a difference between those two things, and sometimes that difference changes everything. They described the moments you became quiet as though silence meant you no longer cared. They described your distance as though stepping back meant walking away. They mentioned the times you stopped explaining yourself as if you had suddenly become cold. Yet your soulmate remembered something else. They remembered the way you had tried before you became quiet. They remembered conversations where you had chosen patience even when it would have been easier to react. They remembered small gestures no outsider had witnessed, those tiny moments that rarely look important until someone tries to rewrite the entire story without them. And suddenly, the warning did not feel complete anymore. Something was missing. Your soulmate could feel it. Perhaps you know that feeling too, the strange moment when somebody gives you an explanation that seems convincing on the surface, yet something deeper whispers, "There is more to this." That was the feeling growing inside them. They did not challenge the third party immediately. Instead, they listened longer. And that may have been exactly what caused the truth to begin revealing itself. Because the more this person spoke, the more certain they became, and the more certain they became, the more they accidentally exposed how little they actually knew. One sentence contradicted another. A detail was mentioned that your soulmate knew could not have happened the way it was being described. Then another detail appeared, something strangely specific, and your soulmate quietly wondered how this third party had reached such a conclusion in the first place. The conversation had begun as a warning about you. Now it was turning into a question about the warning itself. Stay till the end, because this is where the emotional weight changes. Your soulmate had spent more time questioning you than you realized. Not because they wanted to doubt you, but because hearing the same interpretation repeatedly can make even a strong heart wonder. What if I misunderstood them? What if their silence really was an answer? What if they stepped away because I mattered less than I believed? These questions had lived quietly inside them, and the third party had unknowingly touched every one. Yet instead of making those doubts stronger, something unexpected happened. Your soulmate began comparing what they were being told with what they had actually experienced with you. And memory has a strange honesty when we stop trying to control it. They remembered a moment when you could have embarrassed them but chose discretion. They remembered a conversation when you could have demanded reassurance but gave them space. They remembered how you noticed changes in their mood without making everything about yourself. None of these moments were grand enough for outsiders to notice. That was precisely why they mattered. The third party had built an opinion using visible fragments. Your soulmate had lived through the invisible parts. And for the first time, those invisible parts began carrying more weight than the warning. Something important is waiting for you, because the next realization did not arrive through anything you said. You were not there defending yourself. You were not explaining your intentions. You were not trying to prove that someone else was wrong. In fact, your silence, the very thing that had been presented as evidence against you, started becoming the reason your soulmate looked deeper. They wondered why you had not chased every misunderstanding. Why had you not tried to correct every rumor, every assumption, every version of the story that made you look different from who you believed yourself to be? And then a possibility entered their mind: maybe your silence had never been emptiness. Maybe it had been restraint. Maybe you had reached a point where you no longer wanted connection built on endless explanations. Maybe you wanted someone to understand you because they had paid attention, not because you had argued your way into being believed. That realization landed differently. Your soulmate grew quieter. The third party noticed. "You don't believe me?" they asked. But your soulmate did not answer the question directly. Instead, they asked something simple: "How do you know that?" Such a small sentence. Yet everything shifted around it. The third party paused. Not for long, but long enough. And your soulmate noticed. They repeated one of the earlier claims, almost as if repetition could replace certainty. Your soulmate listened again, only now they were hearing the conversation differently. When someone has already decided who you are, they tend to interpret every detail through that decision. Your soulmate suddenly recognized that pattern. Your silence had been labeled rejection because rejection was already expected. Your independence had been labeled distance because distance fit the story. Your emotional boundaries had been labeled indifference because indifference made the warning easier to justify. But what if the same actions meant something completely different? What if stepping back was the only way you knew to protect the peace of a connection that had become crowded by too many voices? What if your silence was not punishment at all, but the moment you stopped fighting to be understood by people determined to misunderstand you? The thought stayed with your soulmate. And once it arrived, it would not leave. The third party kept speaking, but your soulmate had begun traveling backward through their own memories. A message you once sent came back to them. Not the exact words, but the feeling behind them. You had not demanded anything. You had not made promises too large to carry. You had simply made one thing clear: you wanted honesty more than performance. At the time, your soulmate had read those words quickly. Now they understood them differently. You had been telling them who you were all along. Quietly. Consistently. Without forcing them to believe you. Then came another unexpected detail. The third party referred to something that supposedly happened after you pulled away. Your soulmate knew part of that timeline. They knew you had already gone quiet before the event being described. The explanation could not fit the sequence. That single inconsistency might have seemed small to anyone else, but to your soulmate it opened a door. If this detail was wrong, what else had been assumed? What else had been repeated until it sounded like truth? And perhaps most importantly, who had originally created the version of you that this third party believed? The warning suddenly seemed less final. It became a trail. Your soulmate did not want an argument. They wanted clarity. And clarity rarely arrives through the loudest voice in the room. It arrives when someone becomes willing to question the story they were handed. There was another pause. Then your soulmate asked a question the third party clearly had not expected. Did they ever actually say that to you? Silence. That silence was different from yours. Yours had been interpreted for months. This silence needed no interpretation. It revealed uncertainty all by itself. The third party admitted they had not heard it directly from you. They had heard it through someone else. And suddenly, the warning that had sounded so certain was no longer coming from personal knowledge. It had traveled. One person had interpreted something. Another person had repeated it. A third person had added context. And by the time the story reached your soulmate, your quiet choices had become something you may never have intended them to mean. Imagine that moment. Not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a soft internal collapse of an old belief. Your soulmate realized they had nearly allowed someone else's interpretation to become the final meaning of your behavior. That realization carried emotion because it forced them to look at themselves too. Had they asked you enough questions? Had they listened when you tried to explain? Had they been waiting for grand reassurance while overlooking the quiet evidence already in front of them? They could not answer all of it at once. But one thing became increasingly clear: staying away from you simply because someone else said so no longer felt right. And yet, this was not the full truth. There was still a reason the third party had become so invested in keeping distance between you. Your soulmate sensed it because the conversation changed when they started asking where the information came from. The confidence faded. The answers became shorter. Something that had been presented as concern suddenly seemed attached to another emotion, perhaps protectiveness, perhaps misunderstanding, perhaps something more personal that had never been admitted. Your soulmate did not accuse them. They simply watched. And in watching, they saw something that words had been hiding. The third party was not only worried about what you might do. They were worried about what your soulmate might choose if they saw you clearly. That distinction mattered. Because now the conversation was no longer about whether you were good or bad, right or wrong, close or distant. It was about influence. About whose voice your soulmate trusted when your own voice was absent. And your absence had created an unusual test. Would they believe the story told about you, or would they remember the person they had actually known? Your soulmate began remembering more. Your patience. Your hesitation before difficult conversations. The way you sometimes disappeared into silence not because you lacked emotion, but because emotion had become too complicated to express cleanly. They remembered times you returned calmer instead of returning louder. And suddenly a painful but meaningful possibility emerged. Perhaps they had mistaken your emotional control for emotional absence. Perhaps they had been waiting for dramatic proof from someone whose deepest feelings had always appeared in quieter forms. If that resonates with something inside you, stay with this moment, because the truth is not that silence is always right or that misunderstanding should simply be ignored. The deeper truth is that genuine connection requires curiosity. People who care enough to understand ask questions before accepting conclusions. And that was precisely what your soulmate was finally beginning to do. They were becoming curious about you again. Not about the version circulating around you. Not about what somebody thought you meant. About you. Your real motivations. Your real experience. Your side of the moments they once thought they understood. Then the third party said something unexpected. They admitted that they had always felt your soulmate changed whenever your name appeared. Not negatively. They became softer. More reflective. Harder to persuade. That admission revealed more than they intended. Your soulmate noticed immediately. Changed how? They asked. The answer came slowly: you stopped listening to everyone else. And there it was. A completely different truth hiding beneath the warning. Perhaps this third party had not been trying to separate you because they knew some terrible secret. Perhaps they had become uncomfortable with how strongly your presence encouraged your soulmate to think for themselves. Perhaps every time your soulmate considered reconnecting with you, they became less dependent on outside opinions. The warning, "Stay away," suddenly carried another possible meaning: stay where the story about you can remain unchallenged. Because seeing you again might reveal that the story had never been complete. Your soulmate felt that realization deeply. Yet they still did not rush toward a decision. They wanted evidence, not another emotional reaction. So they did something quietly significant. They went back to the beginning. Old conversations. Old messages. Memories they had avoided because revisiting them stirred too much uncertainty. This time, they were not searching for proof that you wanted them. They were searching for truth. And when people stop searching for the answer they prefer and start searching for what actually happened, details begin speaking differently. One message stood out. Something you had said much earlier, almost casually, about needing distance when too many people became involved in something personal. At the time, your soulmate had barely noticed it. Now the sentence seemed to illuminate months of confusion. You had not vanished without reason. You had already hinted at the reason. Too many voices. Too many interpretations. Too much emotional noise around something that may have needed privacy to grow. Your soulmate sat with that thought. And for the first time, your silence did not feel like a wall. It felt like a boundary. A boundary they had not understood. A boundary that perhaps had not been expressed perfectly, but still came from somewhere real. Then something else caught their attention. A date. A message. A conversation involving the person who had originally passed information to the third party. The timing did not make sense. Your soulmate looked again. And this is where the story quietly turned. The warning they had received had been built around an assumption that could not possibly fit what had actually happened. Someone had interpreted your action using information that came later. The sequence had been reversed. Your soulmate suddenly understood that the entire conclusion about why you went silent might have been wrong from the beginning. They felt something rise inside them, not anger, not revenge, but clarity. That clean, almost startling feeling that comes when confusion finally finds one solid fact. And with that fact came a new question, one your soulmate had not dared to ask until now. If you did not go silent for the reason everyone believed, then what really happened? That question followed them long after the conversation ended. The third party's warning had not pushed them away from you. It had accidentally pushed them toward the truth. And the closer they looked, the more your silence seemed to be protecting something they had never noticed. Something tender. Something connected to a choice you made when you believed their peace mattered more than being immediately understood. But there was still one missing piece, the one detail that could explain why you chose not to defend yourself when the misunderstanding first began. Your soulmate was about to discover where that detail had been hiding, and when they did, the entire meaning of "stay away from you" was going to change again. The detail had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, hidden not because anyone had carefully buried it, but because nobody had thought to ask the one question that mattered most: what were you trying to protect when you stepped away? Your soulmate returned to that question again and again, and with every pass through the memories, the old explanation became less convincing. They had once believed your silence meant you were finished. The third party had reinforced that belief, turning uncertainty into something that sounded final. But now your soulmate could see that you had not disappeared at the first sign of difficulty. You had stayed longer than most people realized. You had tried to keep certain conversations private. You had absorbed misunderstandings without immediately exposing everyone involved. And when the situation became crowded with opinions, you made a choice that looked like distance from the outside but felt very different when seen from within. You stepped back because you did not want love, trust, or emotional connection to become a competition between voices. That realization softened something inside your soulmate. They began remembering the exact period when everything changed between you. There had been tension, yes, but there had also been something else: pressure from people surrounding the connection, constant interpretations of your actions, and small private moments becoming topics for people who were never meant to carry them. Your soulmate remembered how often they had asked others what you might be thinking instead of simply asking you. It was not done with bad intentions. Sometimes people seek outside opinions because they are afraid of hearing an answer directly. But the result was still the same. Your relationship had slowly become surrounded by commentary, and every new opinion made your real voice harder to hear. Then came the moment your soulmate had forgotten. You had once said something simple: "I don't want this to become something everyone gets to define." At the time, those words had seemed almost ordinary. Now they carried a different weight. Don't skip, because this is where the truth begins changing the emotional center of the entire story. The third party who had warned your soulmate to stay away had heard about that statement too, but they had interpreted it differently. They believed you wanted secrecy because you had something to hide. Your soulmate now wondered whether the opposite had been true. Maybe you wanted privacy because there was something genuine you were trying to preserve. Those are not the same thing. Privacy protects something intimate. Secrecy conceals something that cannot survive the light. Your soulmate began asking themselves which one your behavior had actually reflected. They remembered that you had never asked them to lie for you. You had never asked them to pretend you did not exist. You had never demanded that they abandon the people around them. You simply seemed uncomfortable when too many outsiders began deciding what your connection meant. That difference mattered. Suddenly, the third party's warning looked less like a response to something you had done and more like a response to something they feared might happen if your soulmate trusted their own experience over everyone else's interpretation. Stay till the end, because one quiet discovery was about to make that possibility even harder to ignore. Your soulmate found an old exchange, not something dramatic, not some hidden confession, just a forgotten conversation where another person had casually admitted that they had never actually spoken to you directly. Yet that same person had been one of the strongest voices shaping the story about you. Your soulmate reread the message twice. Then a third time. A strange calm entered the room. How could someone be so certain about your motives without ever asking you what they were? How many conclusions had been formed like that? How many people were confidently describing a version of you they had created from second-hand fragments? Your soulmate began tracing the story backward. One person had assumed you were withdrawing because you had lost interest. Another had heard that assumption and repeated it as though it were something you had said. Someone else added that you were probably keeping options open. The third party heard all of those pieces, connected them together, and eventually delivered the warning, "Stay away." It sounded serious because several people were saying similar things. But several people repeating the same assumption does not transform an assumption into truth. Your soulmate could finally see the pattern. One interpretation had multiplied until it sounded like evidence. And the person at the center of the story you had said almost none of it. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate then remembered the one conversation where you actually had tried to explain yourself. You had been careful with your words. You had not blamed anyone. You had simply said that you could feel the connection changing whenever other people became involved. You said that when something meaningful has to survive constant judgment, it becomes difficult to hear your own feelings clearly. Your soulmate had misunderstood that at the time. They thought you were asking them to choose you over everyone else. Now they realized you may have been asking for something much simpler: think for yourself. Listen to your own experience. Decide what something means based on what actually happens between the two people living it. That realization brought an uncomfortable question with it. Had your soulmate ever truly done that? Or had they spent so much time gathering opinions that they eventually lost contact with their own instincts? There was no easy answer. Yet something about finally asking the question felt freeing. Your soulmate was not trying to blame themselves. They were simply beginning to recognize how much influence had surrounded something that should have been more personal. And then the third party contacted them again. The tone was different this time. Less certain. They wanted to know why your soulmate had suddenly become quiet. Your soulmate answered calmly, "I'm thinking." That answer seemed to make the third party uneasy. They asked what there was to think about. After everything they had explained, surely the decision should have been obvious. Stay away. Move forward. Stop looking backward. But your soulmate no longer heard those words the same way. Why does this matter so much to you? They asked. The question changed everything. There was a pause on the other side. A pause long enough to reveal that the answer was not simple. The third party said they were only trying to protect them. Your soulmate believed that part might even be sincere. People can care about someone and still misunderstand a situation. They can offer advice from love while unknowingly allowing their own fears, experiences, and assumptions to shape the advice. So your soulmate did not attack them. Instead, they asked something gentler: protect me from what exactly? Another pause. Then came answers that sounded familiar. From being disappointed. From getting hurt. From wasting time. From returning to something complicated. Reasonable concerns on the surface. Yet none of them explained why you specifically had become the person they needed protection from. Your soulmate asked again, what did they actually do? And this time, the third party struggled to produce anything beyond interpretation. You became quiet. You pulled away. You stopped chasing. You seemed different. But your soulmate now saw the hidden assumption connecting all of those statements: if you cared, you would have behaved the way they expected you to behave. What if that expectation had been wrong? What if you had cared deeply but reached a point where continuing to chase felt unhealthy for the connection? What if stepping back had not been abandonment but an attempt to stop repeating the same cycle? The third party had interpreted your restraint as proof of indifference. Your soulmate was beginning to interpret it as something more complicated and more human. The emotional peak arrived quietly. Your soulmate went back to the final message you had sent before the long silence. For months, they had remembered only the ending. They remembered that you said you needed space. They remembered the ache that followed. They remembered waking up the next day and seeing no new message from you. But now they read the entire thing, slowly, without the emotional fog that had surrounded it the first time. And there, halfway through, was the sentence they had almost completely forgotten: I don't want us to keep hurting something good by reacting to everybody around us. Your soulmate stopped reading. That line did not sound like someone who had stopped caring. It sounded like someone exhausted by noise. Someone who still believed there was something good underneath the confusion. Someone who did not know how to preserve it while everyone kept pulling at it from different directions. Your soulmate felt the memory reorganizing itself. Suddenly, the moment you stepped away looked completely different. You had not been closing a door. You may have been trying to stop both of you from damaging what remained while emotions were too crowded to handle carefully. That did not make every decision perfect. It did not mean you had expressed everything clearly. It did not erase the pain your silence may have caused. But it gave the silence context. And context can transform judgment into understanding. Your soulmate sat with that truth longer than they expected. They thought about the third party's warning. Stay away from you. Such a simple sentence. Yet simple sentences can hide complicated assumptions. The warning had been built on the idea that distance always means rejection, that silence always means indifference, and that someone who stops chasing must have stopped caring. Your soulmate now knew life was not that simple. Sometimes people become quiet because they are overwhelmed. Sometimes they step back because they do not trust themselves to speak well in the moment. Sometimes they stop chasing because chasing has turned connection into pursuit instead of mutual understanding. And sometimes the most caring thing a person can do is stop forcing a conversation until both people are ready to have it differently. That realization did not instantly solve everything, but it changed the direction of your soulmate's heart. Instead of asking, "Why did they leave me?" they began asking, "What was happening inside them when they left?" That is a very different question. One looks for blame. The other looks for understanding. And understanding was exactly what had been missing from the beginning. Then came another small discovery, almost accidental. Your soulmate remembered a mutual acquaintance who had spoken to you during the period when everything became quiet. Unlike the others, this person had never offered strong opinions. They had simply said, "There was more going on than people realized." At the time, your soulmate dismissed the comment because it felt too vague. Now it returned with new importance. They reached out. The conversation began carefully. Your soulmate did not ask for gossip. They asked only one question: did they ever tell you why they stepped back? The response came slowly. The acquaintance said you had not shared every detail, but you had said something memorable. You were tired of being interpreted through other people. You felt that every action you took became evidence for someone else's theory. If you reached out, people said you were desperate. If you gave space, they said you did not care. If you explained yourself, they said you were defensive. If you stayed silent, they said you were hiding something. You had reached a point where no response seemed capable of existing on its own. Every choice was being translated before your soulmate could experience it directly. So you chose the only option that gave the situation room to breathe. You stopped participating in the noise. Your soulmate felt that deeply. Not because it made you flawless, but because it finally made your behavior understandable. You had not stepped away from them alone. You had stepped away from the entire emotional environment surrounding the connection. And suddenly, the third party's warning carried an irony nobody had noticed. The very influence that had been telling your soulmate to stay away from you may have been part of the reason you stepped away in the first place. Your soulmate did not know what to do with that realization immediately. It was too layered. They needed time to separate regret from clarity. They wondered how many opportunities had been lost because both of you were responding not only to each other but to the voices around you. They wondered whether you had also misunderstood things about them because someone else had filled in gaps with assumptions. Maybe the confusion had traveled both directions. Maybe nobody had been entirely wrong or entirely right. Maybe two people had simply stopped hearing each other clearly while everyone else kept speaking louder. That thought softened the story. It stopped being a battle between you and a third party. It became something more meaningful, a lesson about how quickly connection can become distorted when personal experience is replaced by outside interpretation. Your soulmate began feeling less interested in deciding who was to blame and more interested in discovering what was true. And that change mattered more than anything else. Because once a person stops trying to defend their old conclusion, they become available to new information. Your soulmate was becoming available. Then the third party revealed something unexpectedly vulnerable. They admitted they had experienced a painful relationship years earlier where someone repeatedly disappeared and returned. Because of that history, your silence immediately looked familiar to them. They had seen your distance and assumed they already knew where it would lead. For the first time, your soulmate understood why the warning had carried so much emotion. It was not only about you. It was about an old experience belonging to someone else. A past situation had been placed over your story like a transparent image, making different circumstances appear identical. The third party had not necessarily wanted to destroy anything. They had been afraid your soulmate would repeat something that once hurt them. Their intentions may have contained care. Their interpretation was still incomplete. That distinction allowed your soulmate to hold compassion without surrendering their own judgment. They did not need to make the third party a villain in order to recognize that the advice had been influenced by personal history. This was the emotional maturity the entire situation had been missing. Different people can mean well and still be wrong about what another person needs. Your soulmate could appreciate concern while still choosing to investigate the truth personally. And once they understood that, something powerful changed. The warning lost its authority. It became simply one perspective among many. Your soulmate looked back at everything they knew about you and finally gave their own experience equal weight. They remembered laughter no outsider had heard. Moments of kindness nobody had documented. The way you stayed present during conversations that were difficult. The way you sometimes looked for peaceful solutions even when neither of you knew how to find them. Those memories had been overshadowed by the final silence for too long. Now they returned. Not as proof that the relationship had been perfect, but as proof that one painful chapter should not automatically erase everything that came before it. Your soulmate began thinking about what they would say if they had one completely honest conversation with you, a conversation untouched by friends, family, assumptions, pride, or fear of being misunderstood. Would they accuse you? No. Would they pretend nothing happened? No. What they wanted was simpler. They wanted to ask you what that season had actually felt like from your side. They wanted to hear your answer without preparing a rebuttal. They wanted to explain their own confusion without turning it into blame. They wanted to understand whether the connection had ended because neither of you cared enough or whether it had simply become too crowded for either of you to hear what the other person was really saying. And then came the thought that surprised them most. What if you had been waiting for exactly that kind of conversation? Not waiting in the sense of putting your life on hold. Not expecting some dramatic reunion. Simply hoping that one day, if your paths crossed emotionally again, the conversation would finally be different. More honest. Less influenced. Less defensive. More direct. Your soulmate could not know for certain. But for the first time, the possibility felt real. The truth that came out had not been a shocking secret about who you were. It was something quieter and perhaps more meaningful. The story about you had been shaped by people who were interpreting your silence through their own experiences, fears, and assumptions. Your soulmate had almost accepted that story completely. Now they were beginning to separate what others believed from what they themselves had actually lived. Yet one final question remained, and this one reached deeper than everything else. If the third party had misunderstood why you stepped away, What had your soulmate misunderstood about the moment immediately before you did? There had been one conversation, brief, emotional, seemingly ordinary, that suddenly looked very different in hindsight. Your soulmate remembered one sentence you said near the end. At the time, they thought you were simply tired. Now they realized you may have been trying to tell them exactly what was happening without saying it directly. And when they finally understood what that sentence really meant, they saw that your silence had never started where everyone thought it did.